Protecting His Heart, a Lawson family novel, the Lawson Family Series, Book 2, written by Tracey Cramer-Kelley, read by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, 20 years ago. 12-year-old Ian McCleary peeked up at Kent Lawson as he paced the hospital exam room. His best friend's dad was a big man, but had never made Ian feel scared, not like his own dad. Ian stared at the floor, cradling his right arm with his left hand. It didn't hurt quite as bad now. The doctor said it was broken. Broken? He'd been beat up before, but had never broken anything. "Ian, son?" The big man came to a halt in front of Ian, then bent at the knee so they were eye to eye. "I need to ask you a question, and I need to ask you to honestly answer it." He was going to ask Ian something that would be hard to answer. Ian just knew it. "Yes, sir?" He tried to make his voice sound strong, but it didn't come out that way. Kent's beefy hand came down on Ian's shoulder. He spoke carefully, holding Ian's gaze. "This isn't the first time your father has hit you, is it?" Ian's eyes dropped. He thought he'd hit it well, but they had noticed. They knew. Shame flared in his chest, but also another emotion just as strong: hate. And yet, could he betray his father? Ian loved the Lawsons. He loved how they joked around with each other, especially how his best friend Jamie and his brothers teased their little sister Carly. He loved how their house was always full of music and laughter, how Mrs. Lawson fussed over him at every meal, and how they cheered Ian and Jamie at their baseball games. He loved that Mr. Lawson took him fishing, like he was part of the family, if only. Ian swallowed, feeling Kent Lawson's eyes on him, but unable to meet them. He couldn't lie to the one man he respected more than any other. "No, sir." Kent's hand tightened on his shoulder, but he didn't speak. Had he done the right thing? His answer was honest, but maybe he'd deserved it. Maybe he brought on Seamus McCleary's wrath himself. "It's not your fault, son." Kent's normally loud voice was heavy and thick. Ian was mortified to feel tears in his eyes. He'd promised himself he wouldn't cry no matter how bad it hurt. But this was pain of a different kind, a kind he didn't understand. "The doctor's going to put a cast on that arm, and then we'll take you home," Kent said. Home? The thought of going home filled Ian with panic. Would he be there? Would he? Kent squeezed his shoulder, and Ian realized his whole body had tensed up. "You're going home with us." Chapter 1, Present Day, New Year's Eve. Ian set his glass on the high-top table. New Year's Eve celebrations were well underway at Leo's bar, and all he had in front of him was a Coke. "You on duty tonight?" Leo himself leaned against the table. Ian had known Leo since his bar-hopping days as a younger man, but since Ian made the move from Minneapolis Vice to small-town cop 3 years ago, he'd been called to Leo's bar more times than he could count. In fact, it felt odd to be a patron. The way Leo hovered, Ian guessed he felt the same. If he were a bar owner, would he want the town cop to hang out in his bar on his nights off? Shoot, Leo probably hoped Ian was on duty. Ian shook his head, chuckling inward at the look on Leo's face. But then a splash of color at the other end of the bar caught his attention, and he swung his gaze that way. Rachel was here, and Josh was with her. He watched as Josh and his buddies greeted each other with raucous laughter. Josh bellowed his drink request out as he grabbed at Rachel's ass, obviously well on his way to being drunk. Rachel's smile was tight, and Ian's gut clenched with a familiar, deep-seated anxiety. "Yeah, there was a reason I'm not drinking." There were perks to being a small-town cop, but at the moment he wished he were invisible. It would help him do what he came to do. He realized Leo had said something to him. "What's that?" "Do you need another Coke?" Leo said. He shook his head again. "Okay, you know where to find the good stuff if you change your mind." Leo shrugged. Ian watched the man wander back behind the bar. What he came to do. Hell, he wasn't even sure what that was. He knew Leo's was a place Josh frequented when he was on his drinking binges. He knew that because he kept keeping tabs on him since the holiday party. He'd even looked him up in the system. What he'd found didn't make him feel any better. And then there was the shiner Rachel was sporting at the party he'd broken up last Halloween. Across the room, Josh frowned at Rachel. Ian strained to read his lips. "Why couldn't you wear something nice?" By the way Josh tipped his head toward another woman, then looked at Rachel as if she were a hideous monster, Ian understood Josh's definition of nice to be a top so tight a woman's breasts were nearly falling out, and a skirt so short she'd have every Tom, Dick, and Harry trying to put their hands up it. Not to mention it was completely inappropriate for the -14-degree weather in northern Minnesota. Ian clenched his jaw. No doubt if Rachel had dressed like that, Josh would accuse her of being a slut or cheating on him. Then again, if Rachel had dressed like that, Ian would have insisted she take his jacket. He shouldn't even be here. His best friend and adoptive brother, Jamie, was waiting for Ian a few blocks away, along with his fiancée and a half-dozen friends. He would give it 10 minutes, he told himself, and then he'd leave. He'd put Rachel out of his head and enjoy not having to be a cop on New Year's Eve. Jamie. He was happy for Jamie, he really was. Jamie had been through a rough patch, but he had Kira now, and he was about to leave to follow his dream of being a professional baseball umpire. Ian was thrilled for him, but he couldn't help the increasingly frequent stabs of jealousy, the insidious thoughts about whether he was doing what he was meant to do. He thought about his time in Vice and thought it had prepared him for anything, but being a cop in the small town he'd grown up in was stressful in a whole different way. Still, he wouldn't trade it. After 8 years in the big city, it had felt right to come back to Nash and the family who'd taken him in as their own and raised him to be the responsible adult he was now. Rachel tugged at Josh's arm. Ian couldn't hear what she said to him, but heard Josh's reply. "It's New Year's Eve. Everyone's drinking. If you're going to be a nag, then go home." Ian's body tightened. Insults, name-calling, and public put-downs were all weapons of abuse designed to erode self-esteem and make a person feel powerless. If Josh told Rachel she was worthless often enough, she would start believing it. That thought, as much as Josh's behavior, had Ian standing and moving toward her at the moment he saw Josh step outside. "Rachel?" The touch on her shoulder was light, but she still flinched before she realized it wasn't Josh. She turned to find the amber eyes she couldn't seem to forget since the bachelorette party last summer. She'd never talked that easily with a man. He was so nice. And wow, Ian McCleary looked even better in a tight t-shirt and jeans that hugged his hips than he did in the police uniform. His auburn hair, usually gelled into place, was unfettered tonight, the longer strands on top falling over his forehead, combined with the tightly cropped beard, also auburn, and the ever-present serious expression. He looked every inch the Irishman he was. "How are you?" His eyes searched hers, leaving her feeling strangely exposed. The last time she'd seen him, Halloween, she'd had a black eye. Embarrassment made her drop her gaze. "I'm fine." "And things with Josh?" Her eyes darted toward the door. Oh, God, what would Josh think if she saw him talking to the town cop? He'd only gone out for a nip of the stronger stuff. "How are they?" Ian said. "Fine. Good. I've been worried about you since I saw you at that party," Ian said. "Oh, that was nothing, just the door at the restaurant." He nodded solemnly. "So you said." "Ian, we can't." Her eyes darted to the door again. "You shouldn't even talk to me." Because something flashed in Ian's eyes. "Why?" "Because, just please." "Because Josh might get mad?" He tipped his head and stared at her. Hell yes, Josh would be livid, and one of them would pay the price. But she couldn't tell Ian that. A movement behind Ian made her eyes widen, but before she could utter any sort of warning, Josh had grabbed Ian by the shoulder and spun him around. "I thought it made it clear I don't want you sniffing around my woman," Josh growled. He drew back his arm and swung at Ian, but he was sloppy from alcohol, and Ian easily ducked it. An odd expression came over Ian's face. "She's not a piece of property," he said. "You can't tell her what to do." "She listens to me, asshole, not you," Josh said. Fury, that's what she saw in Ian's expression. It struck her that Ian probably rarely let anyone see that emotion. "Josh, forget it," she said, her voice shaking. "Come on, let's go somewhere else." She tried to push Josh along, but he wouldn't budge. "Let me say this slowly so you don't miss it." Ian's voice dropped low. "You don't deserve her." Josh growled and swung again, and this time his punch connected with the side of Ian's face. Rachel swallowed her scream as Ian reared back from the blow, but then his fist shot out and caught Josh in the side of the head. Josh bellowed and rushed Ian, grabbing him around the middle. Ian didn't go down, so Josh let go and let his fists fly. Ian seemed to put up with it for a few seconds, but then he put one fist hard into Josh's stomach. Josh went down, his mouth making weird sucking motions. A uniformed police officer stepped between the two men. "Break it up," he barked. "Get up, you piece of shit." Ian looked like he was going after Josh again, but the cop got an arm around his chest. "McCleary, what the hell?" Ian shrugged the cop's arm off. "He took the first swing," he said. The crowd standing around murmured their agreement. The cop looked at Josh on his hands and knees, holding his stomach. Then he bent over and yanked him up. "Pretty lit up, too," he said. "Reckon we need to give him a little time out." Ian nodded, but his gaze was focused on Rachel. Hands tugged at her. Rachel let herself be pulled away as Josh sweared a blue streak. He looked on in shock as the officer handcuffed and led him away. Scanning the bar, she saw Leo push Ian through the kitchen door.